Alison. Yeah, hello everybody and greetings from Nottingham, England. I'd like to thank Therapro especially for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation on boosting math skills and giving me the opportunity to tell my story of how the NumberCoach books came about and how they've helped so many children over the years. I started out as a teacher and then developed my career to specialize in helping those that needed extra support with maths. I'm a passionate believer in the value of people having those basic math skills to get through life. I think Alison mentioned if you've got any questions as you go along, please ask them. Don't wait till the end and we'll try and get to you. I might not get to the questions straight away, but hopefully we'll get to them as we go through. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about the differences that children have and adults in learning maths. Because without looking at those differences and the difficulties people have, we can't look at the ways to overcome them. And then we'll look into the NumberCoach system, the books that were developed over 20 years ago and used in about 25% of UK schools now. So they're well established, well used here, and I'm hoping that they're going to be able to help children in the States as well get the basics of maths skills as well. Apologies if I keep using the word maths rather than maths, and you've got to cope with my British accent as well. So we'll start off. I'd like to find out a bit about you. Who are you? What's your job? Alison, are you okay with the first poll?
Yeah, we'll get that launched right now. So, all right. So it looks like a good chunk of our audience is OTs. We have 91% saying OTs and 9% saying other.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks, Alison. It's nice to know who I'm talking to. I was just telling Alison before this webinar started that my daughter's just started training in speech and language therapy in the UK, and she's loving that. So my story and the story of NumberCoach and the story of boosting math skills started with Chris. He was a wonderful child. I was in a classroom in 1999, seemed like a long time ago now, in a secondary school, and Chris was 14. Apologies for the fairly bad picture, but he did give me permission to use this all those years ago. And it was towards the end of the day, just after 3 o'clock, and Chris walked into my classroom, and I didn't have a class in there at the time, and he'd been thrown out of a lesson. He'd not for either behaviour, attitude. His maths teacher had asked him to, just leave for the last 10 minutes, probably to save his sanity. And Chris came in. I've never met him before, and he asked me how long it was till the end of the day. So I pointed up at the clock, the analog clock on the wall, and said, "There you go." And it transpired that he couldn't tell the time on an analog clock, and he couldn't work out that if it was 3:05, it was 15 minutes till 3 when the bell went at the end of the day. So we got chatting, and I said to him, 7 and something makes 10. Go on, Chris, 7 and something makes 10. So he said 7, 8, 9, 10, 1, 2, 3, 4. He said 7 and 4 makes 10. And so Chris became a project of mine. And over the next months, I worked with him and found out what the problems were, why he didn't have, at 14 years old, a grasp of basic number. And my research came up with 7 things. And the first one, well, the nature of maths, visual and spatial, directional confusion. You can see there the issues that Chris had. And I'll talk to you about those, because then we'll look at how the NumberCoach books covers each of those to enable Chris to get a foundation, a solid foundation in maths that he can use in his life. So go on to poll 2 now. I'd like to find out, Alison, if people are thinking of a person that they would like to boost math skills for. There might be a number of people, but just trying to focus on one. How old are they? What sort of age? What age are they? It'd be nice to have an idea of the age group of the person you're thinking about. So when we come to look at it a bit further, I can focus it on that age group on there. How are we going, Alison?
Great. Looks like we've got everybody answering here. Let's look at the results. So we have 25% that 18 plus grouping, 9 to 12.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, we're seeing 63% in that 5 to 8-year-old grouping and 13% in that 9 to 12 grouping.
Ah, right. So we've thank you. So there's more people looking at 18 plus than I thought there would be, but that's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you for that. Because one thing we do with the books is we realize that math is a hierarchical subject. Unless you've got the foundations, it's really hard to build on it. And Chris did not have the foundations on which to build. So we had to go, rather than what was happening in his math classroom, and they were repeating everything he needed to learn, they didn't say, right, let's go right back to the very beginning, get the building blocks in place and make that happen. Chris certainly had competence in specific areas. He was brilliant at map reading and shapes and space, but when basic number skills, he didn't have it. He had a massive anxiety. You tell him something and he would panic as if it was really difficult to learn to do something quickly. And he'd been in that cycle of failure, anxiety, not getting the rewards he needed, getting things wrong. In maths, people get things wrong so quickly, or they know they've got it wrong, they're told they've got it wrong, and therefore that cycle of failure and anxiety is repeated. Now, maths is a language. It's not a foreign language, but it is a language that can seem foreign to some people. And Chris needed it teaching to him. We realized quickly when I was working with him that he had confusion with the signs, the addition, subtraction, division, multiplication. And those things they might have been taught to him, but he hadn't grasped them. And he needed, because he had memories about understanding and emotion, they're one of the two crucial things for memory, because he had no understanding of what it was about. He didn't understand that if you gave him a multiplication question, even such as 5 times 9, he couldn't comprehend what that would be. And especially even going as far as 5.9 times 4.6, you can see there. Why would anyone want to do that? What's the point of that sort of question? Unless you can show somebody there's a point to it, what the real life scenario would be that Gabe came up with that, he wouldn't have as much memory for it if he didn't have the understanding. He had real blocks with short-term memory and long-term memory. He'd struggle with the short-term calculations, and he wouldn't be able to remember the basic facts that could give him the long-term memory. His times tables, his doubling numbers, 7, he'd have to work it out each time because he didn't remember it. He'd have massive problems with the direction of how things worked. He'd be told, of course, that when you've got an addition sum, you start from right to left. However, when we do division here, we go from left to right, and he'd struggle to remember which way around it was. He'd write numbers and letters back to front. 9s would look like P's, and 3s would look like E's. He would have real problems with the direction of how things looked, and it was due to the lack of practice, because he wasn't able to do the maths at the level he was working. He had to go a lot further back. I realized that it's a really strange thing with Chris, that he was given a sequence, he could count up in tens. If I say it to you now, 10, 20, start at 10 and count up in tens. 10, 20, 30, 40. He could do that no problem at all. However, start at 12 and count up in tens. He really struggled. He really struggled on that. It was, going from 12, 22, 32, 42. It wasn't automatic how he transferred the skills. It's really important that he was leaving school in 2 years and he didn't have the basic number skills to get on in life. I love this bit of research that was done at a university in Sweden, funnily enough, showing the importance of maths and English and the difference between the two. And often English and spelling and writing and reading does come first in support and intervention. And I understand that totally because of what it says here. However, math is really important to grasp the basics as a life skill. So what did I do? Oh, goodness. I went back to basics and I ended up writing 2 math coaching books that have the basics of maths within them. I'll explain how they worked. They started off with Chris as worksheets, bits of paper, full gap sheets of paper that, myself and some teaching assistants who were working with him used. But Chris had, I call it death by worksheet, for probably the last 6 or 7 years of his life. He was 14. He'd always struggled in maths. So what did they do when the problem came? They'd give him another worksheet. And so when it was on worksheet, he'd switch off. And it was really interesting that when we put the program together that I developed into a well-produced book, his attitude changed to it. It felt like he was working through a book rather than worksheets. And there's a real big distinction there. And what are these books? They're one-to-one books. So you sit down alongside the student. So Chris will be on one side and I'll be on the other. So they something for little and often. Chris needed, because of his memory, little and often. So 10, 15 minutes a day, no more than that, as many times this week as you can manage. There's a real focus on the mental calculations. Why? Because that enables access to the rest of the maths curriculum. If Chris can do numbers, double numbers, he can then access fractions. He can access equivalent numbers, equivalent fractions. It's really important to get the grounding in mental calculations. You need to work through the whole book, starting at the beginning and working through. You don't know where the gaps in a child's knowledge is. You can give them a test and assessment to find out where their problems lie, but they might get a question right by luck, They might get it right one day and not get it right the next day. So we make sure they start at the beginning of the book and work all the way through. And they've got to get a question right on 3 consecutive occasions. We call it the overlearning method. It's been around for years, but it assumes that just doing something one is not going to stick in your head. You're not going to remember it. You need to get it right on 3 consecutive occasions, and hence the 3 check marks. And it specifically teaches the language of math. So it tells people exactly what vocabulary there is you need to learn and what things mean. This is an example page from the Power of 2 book, and there's a grid system. So the coach would read out the script, or it can be read by the child or the adult. The books, it's really interesting that a quarter of you are thinking about an 18+ person with an issue with number. There is nothing in any of these books which is childlike or condescending. There's no fluffy bunny rabbits there. they're specifically designed for all age groups, because in the UK they're used in prisons and with adult education basic skills as well. There is nothing in them which is condescending for anybody. So the coach would read out adding 10 to these numbers, read out the number which is 10 more than these numbers. For example, you'd say 14. You've got to earn 3 consecutive ticks. Now, the American versions of these books does say check marks rather than the word tick. We've Americanized all the books there. And when you get it right, you give a check mark in the first column. You'd work down just the first column each time. You put the date when the page is started, and then you'd move on to the next page for your 10 or 15 minutes. And then the second time you come to it, this next day or the day after, you come to it, you'd work down the next column. And if it's wrong, you put a dot. If it's right, you put a check mark. And you stop each question when you get 3 consecutive check marks. It's assumed then you know it. The book then repeats and comes back to things, and it builds up really carefully and highly structured. Here's a page from the +1 book. The +1 book is the introductory book of the series. It starts at recognizing numbers, counting numbers, developing number bonds up to 10, doubling and halving, and the language of more than, less than. So it puts the building blocks in place. And here you can see the script, how many less. You can use a number line to help you find out how many there is. And it's really clear and clearly laid out. There's also pages which give people techniques to do things. So here we've got a number line in the book that gives people the techniques to work out how many more and how many less there is. Anybody can be the coach for these books. So you can buy a book for someone you're working with, and anyone can be the coach. So you can do it with them for a few times a week. Parents can do it with them a few times a week. Teachers, coaches, siblings, brothers, sisters can do it with them a few times a week. And they need virtually no training. It's very self-explanatory, but there is a training video, only about 4 or 5 minutes long, on the Therapro website, where you can buy the NumberCoach books. And I think they're doing a great offer at the moment. So you can watch a 4-minute video which can show you exactly how to use the books. And so anyone can be the coach and work with somebody through the book. Do they work? Do the books work? In the UK, over 175,000 children and adults have worked through the +1 and Power of 2 books, the NumberCoach system. The books have sold mostly through word of mouth advertising. We don't promote our books. We don't spend money on the promotion. But people use the books and realize how much they work. And that number is a huge testament to their success. We've had some evidence done. Nottingham Trent University did a study looking at 5,000 UK schools that have used the +1 and Power of 2 books. And they show that those schools have got higher attainment than schools that don't use it. One of the interesting figures that came out of the research, which isn't on the sheet here, is that those schools that used the books had a much lower amount of people who were disapplied from the SATs we have at age 11. So I think it shows that it gets more, using the NumberCoach books, it encourages people to access maths in the classroom as well and not give up on it. So, why do the books work? We looked back and saw the reasons why people struggle with math. And one of the reasons the books work is they go right the way back to the beginning and build up really slowly and gradually the building blocks of number for these children. If any of you got any questions, please ask them type them into the questions box, and I'll get around to answer them as soon as I can. Why do the books work? People, the children then can see their progress. They can look at the pages and realize that they're actually making progress with their math. They can see, oh, before I wasn't getting this question right, I was getting that question right. Because they're repeating the same questions, it's building up that confidence. And of course, because they start at the beginning of the book and work all the way through, they're going to make sure they're going to come across sections which they are confident in, and that boosts their confidence. And math is often about as much confidence as is a really, important way to make progress. Their confidence. They work because they don't leave any gaps at all in someone's knowledge. You start at the very beginning and work all the way through, and it's little and often. And the memory side of things really improves because they do things over and over again. There are 2 books in the series that Therapro stock. Plus one book is from about 6-year-olds and upwards. However, we know from our experience in the UK that many, many children, teenagers, are still using the plus one book. We sell lots of these plus one books to secondary schools in the UK for 11 to 18-year-olds. And as I've mentioned, they're used in prisons and adult education. But the plus one book will start from about the age of 6 and upwards. The Power of 2 book is probably from about aged 8 and 9 upwards, but the books are not age specific. They're not about, oh, this book is for a 13-year-old, this book's for an 18-year-old. The books are for anybody, and it's all about their level of math skills that they have rather than their age. We know that many children who are in their teens and older start with a plus one book, and many start with a Power of 2 as well. The coach, the book is with someone else sitting down next to them, and we call that person the coach. They can be absolutely anybody. It can be you as a therapist. It can be you. It can be a parent. It can be a sibling. It can be a friend. It can be a teacher. It can be a teaching assistant. Anyone can sit down with them. We've found that schemes in schools which have buddies, so 11-year-olds working with younger 7 or 8-year-olds, works really well. Or in older children, 17, 18-year-olds working with younger children. It's not just the child or adult being coached who gets the benefit. It is as much we realize that the confidence and the skills of the coach is improved as well. So the beauty of the NumberCoach books is that anybody can be the coach. It doesn't have to be a specialist in math. It doesn't have to be someone who knows it, who is trained in it. All they need is the skills to be able to work through the book and maybe have seen the video to say how the book works. But all the instructions at the start of the book as well.
Hey, David, it looks like we have a question on if the books require writing or are they verbal only?
It's a really good question. They are verbal in the sense of the questions are asked verbally. And one of the reasons why it works is because the person being coached will have to say the answer. And by saying the answer, they're going to get in their head more. They're going to consolidate it, and it'll make more sense to them. So they are verbal in that sense. And then the only thing that's written down in the book is whether it's right when you do the check mark, or if it's wrong, you do the dot. So they are verbal in that sense. There is space in the book to write down any working out and to help people out. But generally the books are verbal, but all you record is whether the answer is correct, which is a check mark, or they haven't got it right, which is a dot. So hopefully that's answered your question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and then looks like there's just one more that just came in. Does the student need a baseline level of skill for each book?
Good question. No, they don't for the +1 book. The +1 book is for someone who does not need any baseline skills or mathematical knowledge at all. It starts off with basic recognizing numbers, counting numbers, recognizing the shapes of numbers and the signs. And by the end of it, it'll take them to the level where they're able to access the Power of 2 book. So for the Power of 2 book, yes, they do need some prerequisite skills, but all that is in the Power of 2 book. So for the Power of 2 book, they need to be able to recognize numbers, count up to 10. That's basically it to access the Power of 2 book. But for the Power of +1 book, they don't need any prerequisite skills. Anything else, Alison, coming up, or should I move on to a couple of questions that I've been asked?
Sure, let's go ahead and move on to your question.
Okay, how often should the books be used? They, as many times a week as you can, I would suggest. We suggest in the book that 4 or 5 times a week is great. I know some people who've used the book and they manage to do it somehow 7 days a week. And I know that's really tricky for a lot of people, but minimum 3 times a week, we'd say. 4 or 5 times a week is excellent. Any more than that is wonderful. It's the little and often system that does work. So just having a little bit of time on it each day helps the memory issues that I was mentioning earlier. Right, that's all I've got from here. That's given you an idea of the learning difficulties and differences that people have with math. It's told you that hopefully how the books cover each of those areas of math difficulties that people have, and those NumberCoach books are available on the Therapro website. I think there's an offer on at the moment, and I thank you very much for